They thought humiliating me at the country club would break me. My husband's business partners and their wives cornered me like vultures, hurling insults and finally slapping me in front of everyone. What they didn't know was that the quiet woman they just humiliated was married to the man who owned not just their precious country club, but half the city. This is how one slap cost them everything they held dear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca, and until 6 months ago, I lived the kind of life most people would consider unremarkable. I worked as a librarian at the downtown public library, spent my evenings organizing community book drives, and found genuine joy in helping teenagers discover their love for reading. There was nothing flashy about my existence, nothing that would make heads turn or conversations stop. I drove a modest sedan, shopped at department stores, and my idea of a splurge was buying hardcover books instead of paperbacks. I had always been comfortable in my own skin, content with my simple pleasures and meaningful work. The library was my sanctuary, filled with stories of adventure and romance that I devoured during quiet afternoons. My colleagues respected me, the community valued my contributions, and I genuinely believed that happiness came from purpose, not possessions. I never felt the need to compete with anyone or prove my worth through material things. That Tuesday morning started like countless others. I was cataloging new arrivals when Mrs. Henderson, one of our regular patrons, mentioned that her granddaughter was struggling with reading comprehension. Without hesitation, I offered to tutor the girl after school, free of charge. It was something I did regularly, using my own time to help children who couldn't afford private tutoring. These small acts of service filled my heart in ways that money never could. Later that afternoon, while I was helping a young mother find picture books for her toddler, I noticed a commotion near the reference section. A well-dressed businessman was frantically searching through business directories, clearly frustrated. His expensive suit was wrinkled with stress, and his phone kept buzzing with what seemed like urgent calls. Most people walked past him, but something about his genuine distress made me approach. "Excuse me," I said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Can I help you find something specific?" He looked up, and I was struck by the exhaustion in his eyes despite his polished appearance. "I'm looking for information about non-profit organizations in the area," he said, running a hand through his graying hair, specifically ones that focus on education and literacy. "I need to find partners for a charitable foundation I'm trying to establish." My face lit up immediately. "That's exactly what I do in my spare time," I told him enthusiastically. "I coordinate with several literacy programs and educational nonprofits throughout the city. I know their directors personally and could probably save you weeks of research." His relief was palpable. "Really? That would be incredible. I'm Marcus, by the way, and you might just be the answer to my prayers." For the next 2 hours, I shared everything I knew about the local nonprofit landscape. I gave him contact information for directors I trusted, explained which programs were most effective, and even offered to make introductions. Marcus listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. What struck me most was his genuine passion for education and his desire to make a real difference, not just write checks for tax benefits. As the library prepared to close, Marcus stood to leave, then paused. "Rebecca," he said, and I realized I'd never actually introduced myself formally. "Would you consider having dinner with me tomorrow night? I'd love to continue this conversation, and honestly, I haven't met anyone in years who shares my enthusiasm for literacy programs." There was something in his tone that wasn't just professional interest, and I found myself saying yes before I could overthink it. The next evening, Marcus picked me up in a car that was clearly expensive, but not ostentatious. He took me to a small Italian restaurant that was family-owned and focused more on authentic food than impressive ambiance. Throughout dinner, we talked about books, education, social responsibility, and our shared belief that knowledge was the greatest gift you could give someone. He told me about his business, how he'd built a successful investment firm from nothing, and how he'd reached a point where giving back felt more important than earning more. What impressed me most wasn't his success, but his humility about it. He spoke about his wealth as a responsibility rather than an achievement, and he asked detailed questions about my work at the library as if it were the most fascinating career in the world. When I mentioned my volunteer tutoring, his eyes actually sparkled with admiration. Most wealthy people I'd encountered through various charity events treated community service workers with polite dismissal, but Marcus treated me like an expert whose opinion mattered. Our second date was even better. He suggested we visit some of the literacy programs I'd recommended, wanting to see them in action before making donations. We spent the afternoon at an after-school program in a low-income neighborhood, reading to children and helping with homework. Watching Marcus interact with those kids, seeing how naturally he connected with them despite his obvious wealth, made me realize he wasn't just another rich guy looking for good press. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By our third date, I was falling for him hard, but I was also terrified. Men like Marcus didn't end up with women like me in the real world. I lived in a modest apartment, drove an 8-year-old car, and my idea of fine jewelry was the silver necklace my grandmother had left me. He moved in circles where women wore designer gowns to charity luncheons and had personal shoppers. I kept waiting for him to realize I didn't belong in his world. But Marcus seemed to see something in me that I couldn't see in myself. He valued my opinions, sought my advice on his charitable initiatives, and made me feel like my perspective mattered. When he talked about his business dealings or social obligations, he always asked what I thought, genuinely listening to my answers. He made me feel intelligent, valuable, and worthy of respect in a way I'd never experienced before. 3 months into our relationship, Marcus took me to meet his business partner and closest friend, David Richardson. David owned several companies throughout the city and was married to a woman named Victoria who came from old money. The dinner was at their penthouse apartment, and I spent hours agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on a simple black dress that I hoped was appropriate. The evening was a disaster from the moment we walked in. Victoria looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain, and her smile was so fake it hurt to watch. She made subtle comments about my background, asking questions designed to highlight the differences between us. When I mentioned working at the library, she actually laughed and said, "How quaint," like I was a curious artifact rather than a person. David wasn't much better, though he was smoother about his condescension. He kept making references to things I couldn't possibly understand, luxury brands and exclusive experiences that were clearly meant to make me feel out of place. When Marcus excused himself to take a phone call, Victoria leaned forward with predatory interest. "You know, Rebecca," she said with false sweetness, "men like Marcus go through phases. They sometimes get fascinated by the idea of simplicity, but they always come back to their own kind eventually. You seem like a lovely person, but you must realize this can't possibly last. You don't understand his world, and eventually that will matter more than whatever charm you think you have." I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation, but before I could respond, Marcus returned. He must have sensed the tension because his arm immediately went around my waist, pulling me close protectively. He spent the rest of the evening making sure I was included in every conversation, translating references I might not understand, and clearly showing that he valued my presence, but the damage was done. Victoria's words echoed in my mind long after we left. For the next few weeks, I tried to shake off the encounter, but doubt had been planted. Marcus continued to be wonderful, but I found myself analyzing every interaction, wondering if he was starting to see what Victoria had pointed out. When he invited me to business functions, I questioned whether I belonged there. When he wanted to take me to expensive restaurants, I wondered if he was embarrassed by my lack of sophistication. The turning point came when Marcus surprised me with something I never expected. He'd been acting mysteriously for days, taking phone calls in private and smiling secretively when he thought I wasn't looking. Finally, one evening at my apartment, he sat me down with nervous excitement dancing in his eyes. "Rebecca," he began, reaching for my hands, "I have something to tell you, and I hope you'll understand why I kept it private for so long. I've been working on something special, a foundation dedicated to literacy and education programs. But more than that, I want you to run it. I want you to be the director, to use your expertise and passion, to decide how we distribute resources and support programs." I stared at him in shock. "A foundation?" Marcus nodded eagerly. "I've allocated $10 million as the initial endowment, but that's just the beginning. I want to build something lasting, something that will change lives the way you've been changing lives one person at a time. You understand these programs better than anyone I've ever met. You know what works and what doesn't. You care about the mission, not just the prestige." The offer was overwhelming in the best possible way. Here was confirmation that Marcus valued not just me as a person, but my knowledge and abilities. He wasn't trying to change me or lift me up to his level, he was recognizing that I was already exactly where I belonged. But even as my heart soared with possibility, Victoria's words haunted me. Was this his way of keeping me busy while he figured out how to let me down gently? Marcus must have seen the uncertainty in my eyes because he cupped my face gently. Rebecca, I need you to understand something. I'm not offering you this position because we're dating. I'm offering it because you're the most qualified person I know. Your work at the library, your volunteer efforts, your genuine understanding of what these communities need, that's not common. That's special. That's exactly what this foundation needs to succeed. Before I could fully process what was happening, he was down on one knee, pulling out a ring that was beautiful in its simplicity. Not the massive diamond I might have expected, but a perfect sapphire surrounded by smaller diamonds that caught the light like stars. Rebecca, will you marry me? Not because I want to change you, but because I can't imagine building a life with anyone else. You make me want to be better, to do more, to matter in ways that have nothing to do with money. I said yes through tears of joy and overwhelming love. But even in that perfect moment, I couldn't entirely shake the feeling that I was living in a fairy tale that might end when reality set in. Little did I know that reality was about to test us in ways I never could have imagined, and that the woman who had always felt like she didn't belong was about to discover just how much power she actually had. Our wedding 6 months later was everything I had dreamed of, and nothing like what Victoria's circle expected. Instead of an elaborate country club affair, Marcus and I chose the public library's garden courtyard, the same place where we'd first talked about literacy programs. We decorated with books and wildflowers, invited the children from our tutoring programs to be flower girls and ring bearers, and asked guests to donate books instead of traditional gifts. It was beautiful, meaningful, and perfectly us. But what made the day truly special wasn't the venue or decorations. It was watching Marcus interact with my world, my colleagues, my volunteer families, and seeing how naturally he fit in. He spent the reception reading stories to children, discussing book recommendations with elderly patrons, and genuinely connecting with people who had shaped my life. There was no pretense, no condescension, just authentic joy in celebrating with our community. Victoria and David attended, though their faces throughout the ceremony suggested they were attending a funeral rather than a wedding. During the reception, I overheard Victoria telling another guest that Marcus was going through some kind of midlife crisis and would eventually come to his senses. Her words stung, but watching my new husband laugh with a group of teenagers he was mentoring made me realize her opinion didn't matter anymore. Our honeymoon was spent traveling to rural libraries across 3 states, documenting their needs and challenges for our foundation. Most couples would have found this unconventional, but for us, it was perfect. We visited tiny one-room libraries serving farming communities, urban branches struggling with limited resources, and school libraries that hadn't been able to buy new books in years. Each stop reinforced our shared mission and deepened our connection. When we returned home, Marcus surprised me again. He'd purchased a beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing ostentatious or showy, just a warm family home with a library room he'd specifically designed for me. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, comfortable reading chairs by large windows, and a desk where I could plan foundation programs. It was my sanctuary, and it proved once again that Marcus understood what truly made me happy. The Richardson Foundation officially launched 3 months after our wedding, and I threw myself into the work with passionate dedication. We started by partnering with 12 local literacy programs, providing funding for books, technology, and teacher training. I spent my days visiting programs, meeting with directors, and watching our investments transform communities. The work was challenging but incredibly fulfilling, and Marcus supported every decision I made. But our happiness made certain people uncomfortable, particularly Victoria and her social circle. As our foundation gained recognition and media attention, I began receiving invitations to charity luncheons and fundraising galas. These events were networking opportunities that could benefit our programs, so I accepted despite feeling out of place among women who spent more on handbags than our program budgets. The first few events were manageable. I wore simple but appropriate dresses, spoke passionately about our mission when asked, and tried to build relationships with potential donors. Some women were genuinely interested in our work and even became supporters. But others, led by Victoria, seemed threatened by my presence in their exclusive world. They made subtle comments about my background, questioned my qualifications, and treated me like an imposter playing dress-up. I tried to ignore the negativity and focus on the positive connections I was making, but the constant microaggressions wore me down. At one luncheon, a woman loudly wondered how someone with my limited experience could possibly manage a $10 million foundation. At another, Victoria herself suggested that I was in over my head and should consider hiring a more experienced director to actually run things while I served as a figurehead. Marcus encouraged me to stop attending these events if they made me uncomfortable, but I refused to let these women drive me away from opportunities that could benefit our programs. I had worked too hard to build something meaningful to let petty jealousy derail our mission. Besides, I was starting to understand that their hostility wasn't really about my qualifications or background. It was about fear that their world was changing, that success could come from places they didn't control. The situation escalated at Victoria's annual spring charity auction, an event that raised money for various causes while serving as the social event of the season. Marcus and I had donated a literacy program partnership as one of the auction items, and I was excited to speak about our work to a room full of potential supporters. I spent weeks preparing my presentation, gathering stories from children whose lives had been changed by our programs. The morning of the auction, I carefully chose my outfit, a navy blue dress that was elegant without being flashy. I practiced my speech one final time, focusing on the human impact of literacy programs rather than dry statistics. Marcus kissed me goodbye, reminding me that I belonged in that room as much as anyone else, and that our work spoke for itself. I felt confident and prepared as I drove to the country club. Willowbrook Country Club was exactly what I expected from Victoria's world. Manicured lawns, imposing architecture, and an atmosphere of exclusive privilege that seemed designed to intimidate outsiders. I parked my modest car between luxury vehicles and walked toward the entrance, reminding myself that I was there for the children in our programs, not to impress anyone or prove my worth to people who had already decided not to like me. The cocktail hour was in full swing when I arrived, and I immediately felt the weight of judgment from several directions. Women in designer dresses and expensive jewelry clustered in small groups, their conversations stopping when I approached. I smiled politely and tried to join discussions about the auction items, but found myself repeatedly excluded or dismissed, with polite but cold responses. I focused on my mission, approaching potential donors and explaining our literacy programs with genuine enthusiasm. Some women listened politely and asked thoughtful questions, but others seemed annoyed that I was interrupting their social conversations with talk of actual charity work. One woman actually told me that auction events were for networking and socializing, not for discussing the causes they were supposedly supporting. The breaking point came during the silent auction preview. I was standing near our donation display, ready to answer questions about the literacy partnership we were offering, when Victoria approached with 3 of her closest friends. Their expressions were predatory, and I instinctively knew this confrontation had been planned. "Rebecca," Victoria said with false sweetness, "what a surprise to see you here. I wasn't sure this kind of event would be your scene." I smiled politely and gestured toward our display. "I'm here to support our foundation's auction item. We're offering a partnership opportunity that could impact hundreds of children's lives. I thought the ladies here might be interested in making a real difference." Victoria's laugh was sharp and cold. "Oh, how noble. But don't you think you're a bit out of your league here? These women have been supporting charity work since before you learned what philanthropy meant." Her friends nodded in agreement, forming a circle around me that felt increasingly threatening. You can't just marry into this world and expect to be taken seriously. I felt my cheeks flush but kept my voice steady. I'm not trying to marry into anything. I'm trying to support literacy programs that change lives. My qualifications come from years of working directly with these communities, not from my husband's bank account. That seemed to hit a nerve, because Victoria's facade of politeness finally cracked completely. "You little nobody," she hissed, stepping closer. "You think because Marcus is going through some kind of charity phase that makes you one of us. You're playing in a league you don't understand, with money you didn't earn, pretending to be something you're not." Her voice was rising, and other conversations around us were stopping as people turned to watch the confrontation. I tried to step back, but her friends had positioned themselves to block my retreat. "You need to understand your place," Victoria continued, her face twisted with ugly anger. "You're embarrassing yourself and him with this little foundation fantasy. Real philanthropy requires breeding, education, and understanding that you simply don't possess. You're nothing but a librarian playing dress-up with other people's money." The words stung because they echoed my own deepest fears, but I found strength I didn't know I possessed. "I am a librarian," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the now silent room. "And I'm proud of that. I've spent my career helping people access education and opportunity. I've seen firsthand what literacy programs can accomplish. My foundation has already changed dozens of lives, and we're just getting started." Victoria's face turned red with rage. "How dare you lecture me about charity work?" she screamed. "My family has been supporting causes in this city since before you were born. You don't belong here. You don't understand our world, and you certainly don't deserve the life you've stumbled into." Before I could react, her hand flew across my face in a sharp slap that echoed through the silent room. The shock was overwhelming, not just from the physical blow, but from the realization that these women's hatred had driven them to actual violence. My cheek burned, and I could feel tears of humiliation starting to form. The entire room was staring, some faces showing shock at Victoria's behavior, others seeming satisfied that I'd finally been put in my place. For a moment, I felt like that insecure woman who had doubted her worth, wondering if maybe they were right about me not belonging. But then I remembered the children who could read chapter books because of our programs. I thought about the teenagers who had discovered their love of literature through our tutoring. I remembered the gratitude in parents' eyes when their children brought home good report cards for the first time. My worth wasn't determined by these women's approval or by my ability to fit into their narrow world. My worth came from the lives I had touched and the difference I had made. I looked Victoria directly in the eyes, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," I said quietly, but my calmness seemed to enrage her further. She raised her hand again, but this time I was ready. I caught her wrist firmly and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I won't let you or anyone else make me feel ashamed of who I am or what I've accomplished. I've dedicated my life to helping others, and I'm proud of that work. If you think that makes me beneath you, then you've revealed more about your character than mine." I released her wrist and stepped back, holding my head high despite the burning in my cheek and the whispers spreading through the crowd. But Victoria wasn't finished. She was so consumed with rage and humiliation at being challenged publicly that she lost all sense of self-preservation. "You think you're so special because you married money?" she shouted. "Well, let me tell you something, you pathetic little gold digger. Marcus will get tired of your charity project phase, and when he does, you'll be right back where you started. Nobody here will remember your name, and nobody will care what happens to your precious foundation." Her friends were trying to pull her away, clearly recognizing that she had gone too far, but Victoria shook them off. "You don't belong in our world," she continued, her voice rising to a shriek. "You'll never belong here, and everyone knows it. This country club, this community, these people, they're ours. We decide who gets to be part of this life, and we're telling you that you don't qualify." The room was completely silent now, everyone frozen by the ugly scene unfolding before them. I could see security guards moving toward us, but before they could intervene, I heard the sound of expensive shoes clicking rapidly across the marble floor. Marcus appeared at my side, his face dark with an anger I had never seen before. He took in my red cheek, Victoria's defensive posture, and the shocked faces surrounding us. "What exactly is happening here?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I could feel the barely controlled fury radiating from him, and suddenly, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Victoria seemed to realize for the first time that her actions might have consequences beyond immediate satisfaction. She opened her mouth to speak, but Marcus cut her off with a look that could have frozen fire. "Did you just assault my wife?" The question hung in the air like a blade, and Victoria's face went white. I saw her trying to formulate an excuse, but Marcus continued before she could speak. "I can see the handprint on Rebecca's face, and I heard your charming speech about who belongs in your world and who doesn't. How interesting that you think you have any authority to make such decisions." The crowd was pressing closer now, sensing that something significant was happening. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a quick call, speaking quietly but with unmistakable authority. Within minutes, a man in an expensive suit appeared at his side, clearly someone important based on how quickly he had responded to Marcus's summons. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "I'd like to introduce you to James Morrison, the attorney who handles all my business affairs." "James, would you please explain to these people who actually owns Willowbrook Country Club?" The attorney smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Certainly, Marcus. As of 6 months ago, Willowbrook Country Club is owned entirely by Richardson Holdings, which is the primary investment vehicle for Marcus Richardson." The gasps around the room were audible, but Marcus wasn't finished. He looked directly at Victoria, who was now trembling with either rage or fear. "So when you talk about deciding who belongs in your world, you should probably understand that this is actually my world. I own this building, these grounds, and I pay for the privilege that allows you to pretend you have power here." Victoria tried to interrupt, but Marcus held up a hand. "I built my fortune by recognizing value where others see only surface appearances. My wife represents everything that's genuinely valuable in this world. She's intelligent, compassionate, dedicated to helping others, and she's accomplished more meaningful work in the past year than most people do in a lifetime. If you can't see that, then you're not the kind of people I want in my establishment." He turned to address the entire room, his voice firm and final. "Effective immediately, the memberships of Victoria Richardson, David Richardson, and anyone who participated in or encouraged the assault on my wife are permanently revoked. Security will escort you from the premises, and you are not welcome back. Furthermore, any charitable organization that excludes or discriminates against my wife and her foundation will no longer receive support from any of my businesses or properties." The transformation in the room was immediate and dramatic. People who had been watching with cruel amusement were now looking nervously at each other, wondering if they had been too obvious in their enjoyment of my humiliation. Women who had spent years using Victoria as their social leader were suddenly distancing themselves from her, afraid of being associated with her downfall. Victoria herself looked like she might faint. Her face had gone from red to white to green, and she was swaying on her feet. "David," she whispered desperately, "say something." But David was staring at Marcus with the horrified realization that his business partnership and social standing had just evaporated because of his wife's cruelty. Marcus wrapped his arm around me protectively, but his attention remained focused on the crowd. "Let me be absolutely clear," he continued. "My wife doesn't need anyone's approval or acceptance to validate her worth. She's proven her value through her actions, her character, and her impact on this community. If you can't recognize that, then you're not worthy of being in the same room with her." He looked down at me with such love and pride that I felt my own strength returning. "Rebecca, would you like to say anything to these people before we leave?" I looked around the room at faces that ranged from supportive to guilty to terrified, and realized I had nothing left to prove to any of them. "Actually," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I think everything important has already been said. I came here tonight to support literacy programs and connect with people who care about making a difference. I've learned who those people are, and more importantly, who they aren't. Our foundation will continue its work with or without support from this community, because there are children who need books more than I need anyone's approval." As we walked toward the exit, I could hear conversations exploding behind us. Some people were defending Victoria. Others were criticizing her behavior, and many were clearly trying to figure out how to distance themselves from the entire situation. But none of it mattered to me anymore. I had faced my worst fears and survived. More than that, I had discovered that my worth wasn't dependent on their acceptance. Marcus and I drove home in comfortable silence, my hand in his as we processed what had just happened. The woman who had started the evening worried about fitting in had ended it standing up for herself and walking away with her dignity intact. Victoria's slap had been intended to humiliate me, but instead it had revealed her own character and freed me from caring about her opinion. The next morning brought a flood of phone calls and messages. Several women from the auction called to apologize for Victoria's behavior and express support for our foundation. Local media had somehow gotten wind of the story, and reporters wanted comments about the country club incident. Most surprisingly, we received dozens of donation offers from people who had heard about our work and wanted to support literacy programs. But the most meaningful response came from the children in our tutoring program. When word spread about what had happened, they made cards and drawings expressing their gratitude for everything we had done for them. One little girl wrote, "Thank you for helping me love reading. "You are the best teacher ever, and nobody should be mean to you." Those words meant more than any society acceptance ever could. Victoria's attempt to humiliate me had backfired spectacularly. Instead of driving me away from philanthropy, it had generated more support for our programs than months of traditional fundraising. Instead of making me question my worth, it had proven that my value came from my actions and character, not from other people's opinions. And instead of weakening my marriage, it had shown me just how completely Marcus believed in me and our shared mission. 6 months later, the Richardson Foundation had expanded to support literacy programs in 12 states. We had helped thousands of children improve their reading skills, funded teacher training programs, and provided books to libraries that hadn't been able to purchase new materials in years. The work was more fulfilling than anything I had ever imagined, and every success felt like vindication for that night at the country club. Victoria and David's social circle had largely collapsed after their expulsion from Willowbrook. Other wealthy families, recognizing which way the wind was blowing, had distanced themselves from the couple who had been foolish enough to attack the wife of one of the city's most powerful men. Their influence in charitable circles evaporated overnight, and many organizations quietly removed them from leadership positions. As for me, I had learned the most important lesson of my life. My worth had never been determined by expensive clothes, exclusive memberships, or social acceptance. It had always come from my passion for helping others, my dedication to meaningful work, and my ability to see potential where others saw only problems. The woman they had tried to humiliate had always been worthy of respect. I just needed to believe it myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.